leading lights of antitrust, and the current leading lights of antitrust in the Biden administration seem to have entirely forgotten that there's something called a market. And what the market does, what the consumer chooses, is far more important than what you think is fair or equitable. And that's why I oppose many of the cases that that this administration has brought, because they gerrymander markets. They try to find, design a little by, like if you look at congressional elections, they have these weird gerrymandered.
Right.
They do the same thing now with antitrust. They try to find a market that is precisely, that they can go precisely at, and then say, hey, see, there's a monopoly here. But if you look at well, there's no economics, there's no facts, and then they just charge ahead.
Hey folks, welcome to Uncommon Sense in Current Times. I'm here today with Robert Bork Jr. He is the president of the Antitrust Educational Project. And I know for many listeners out there, when they hear the word antitrust, they kind of glaze over. But it's actually a really fascinating piece, and it's very impactful to your everyday life on things. And so I'm really excited to have him on the show to talk with him about this. So welcome. Thank you for coming on the show.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
So let's just kind of let me ask you a question. Like, how did you end up on this? I know your father was very famous in this area. Did you kind of just learn from him and then just eventually just kind of started this project, or how did you end up in this project?
Oh my goodness. Well, that'll take a few minutes, but I just I'm not a lawyer. I was a journalist for a number of years, as he wanted to be. When he got out of the University of Chicago undergrad, he wanted to be a reporter and applied. He thought he had to go to journalism school. I thought that's the way you have to go. So he applied to Columbia, and they rejected his degree from Chicago because it was a great book school. So he went to law school at Chicago instead. And that's one of those great forks in the road, that you hear about. But so I followed his original path and did that until I got fed up with it in 1987, and turned to writing and communication, speech writing, and ultimately advocacy. But yes, so although I'm not a lawyer, I did get a dinner table law degree growing up, and which is unfortunately does not allow me to pass the bar. But so I started the Antitrust Education Project because I was worried about 10 years ago, 9 years ago, that the left, specifically at that time, Senator Elizabeth Warren, were going to hijack antitrust law. They saw it as a very convenient and useful tool for layering on regulations on business, or control of business, and ultimately control of the economy, and a way to degrade capitalism. And this is something my father had worried about back in the 60s when he was teaching antitrust at Yale Law School, and had written about the abuse of antitrust. And ultimately, he wrote a book called The Antitrust Paradox. I just happen to have the third edition here, which I put together and re-released because it was out of print. And So I was concerned about what she was saying. I was concerned about, frankly, very personally, his legacy in this area. He'd written the book. Actually, he'd written the book in the late '60s, and for a variety of reasons, publication was delayed until 1978. Uh, and it was such a impactful. I'm not sure I like that word. It was such a powerful book that uh, it was cited in 1979. A lawyer in a case called Ryder v. Sonotone, which I'm not sure I can remember what it was about at this point, um, cited his logic about what antitrust law is supposed to be and his economic analysis and about consumer welfare. And the Supreme Court in 1979, in their opinion, in that case, unanimously adopted my father's logic. So his thinking. Um, so what we're talking about though is the creation by the Supreme Court of a new standard, a consumer welfare standard for antitrust, and that has been essentially the operating system of antitrust law for the last 45 years. Now, why is that important? Well, because the antitrust laws go back to the Sherman Act of the late 19th century, designed to break up or regulate trusts. Many large corporations were built in those days as trusts, and so they had enormous power. They were accumulating, companies and oil wells and all sorts of things, and there was a fear that they were big and therefore they were going to be too powerful. So the Sherman Antitrust Act was written, uh, but it was then it and two other acts, the Clayton Act and the FTC Act, after that really misunderstood, as my father would say, what antitrust law was supposed to be doing, and they were too vague, so that people like Justice Brandeis and Justice William O. Douglas, uh, railed against big business, the curse of bigness, and wrote opinions from the Supreme Court, from the bench of the Supreme Court, that sided with weak competitors, even small artisanal competitors, against larger, more efficient companies. And the Chicago School of Law and Economics, which my father was part of, we're covering a lot of ground, a lot of history here, in the 50s, looked at what was going on in antitrust, and decided that it was just a paradox, as my father later wrote. It didn't make any sense. The law was didn't they, no one understood what the law meant, and no one was applying it in any rational way. And so he and others started writing a lot about it, and doing a lot of economic analysis. My father, in fact, taught himself calculus to be able to uh, write this book, and ultimately came up with this notion that there should be a consumer welfare standard that held that the logical goal embedded in antitrust law was economic efficiency, delivering lower prices and more innovation and more choices for consumers. And the courts just grabbed that because it finally made sense. I mean, there's a famous uh, interview with Justice Scalia where he says, he never understood what antitrust law was supposed to do until he read the book, and so it became really the law of the land.
Well, let me ask
I'm
this.
sorry, I've gone on far
No,
too.
no, no. Let me, because I just want to make certain. Yeah, I'll be honest. I'm also a lawyer,
I'm
and
not a lawyer, so you're the
business
only lawyer
law.
on this call.
Yeah, I've repented from it. That's why I'm in the restaurant business now. But no, business law was a struggle of mine. Of all of it, I did more litigation type stuff, mostly employment areas. But when I look at like antitrust and I try to understand it, I recognize that there is the problems such as if businesses get too big, they can quash competition. On the flip side, if you side with only the small, weak businesses, then there's no incentive for them to get bigger on it. So there seems to be a struggle between that median in there. Am I stating that correctly? Am I being fair?
Mostly correctly, yes. Look, and I should preface this or explain, because you hinted to your audience that they should care about this. The reason they should care about this, about antitrust, is they should think about it not in terms of this old word antitrust, which refers to something that isn't really even relevant anymore. The businesses aren't organized as trusts; they're organized as corporations or whatever. And what they should be thinking about is competition.
Right.
You know, and so these are competition laws. These are laws supposedly designed to foster competition, so that just as you say, big companies can't become so dominant that they harm competition, and they harm, and as my father would argue, harm consumers, harm the people who are supposed to benefit from these laws. Uh, and that's what the left has long argued and is arguing again now, that bigness is bad. And I should just note that, by the way, if you have a monopoly, it's not against the law to be a monopoly. It's against the law to be to have gotten. It's how you got the monopoly. Did you use? Did you get it illegally? And then it's how you use it. Do you use it to harm uh, competition, harm the consumer? So that's why a lot of people think that my father's work from the left think my father's work is dangerous, because he says that big isn't bad. It's the consumer that has to be protected, and if the consumer is being harmed, then you have to intervene. And so I think I just forgot where you wanted the question to go, but so so I saw this attack coming from the left in 2016, 2017, and really didn't do anything about it at first, but I was trying to think what I could do. And so in 2020, I checked on the book and found that it was out of print, and that the publisher had no interest in printing it again. So I acquired the rights from the then publisher, and looked around for a way to, for another publisher. And after talking to three big publishers, decided that this was, I would have to give up too much control of the book. And they might take years to decide whether they were going to do it and do nothing. So I started a publishing company and published it myself. And which is probably why you can't walk into a bookstore and ask for it, but you can get it on Amazon and Barnes and Noble, and we will print you up one right away, and send it to you when you buy it.
Is
We've
but is that an
had sales.
example? But is
Yeah.
that an example of where some of the larger companies, and just take publishing, and I mean, you got all the self publications, you got, a lot of the small independent mom and pop publications, but if I want to get into a bookstore, I pretty much got to be with one of the few major publishing houses to get in the bookstores. If I want to get it kind of front and center, I'm going to have to be somewhere in that area. Is that an example, though, where there has been not necessarily monopoly, but at least a small amount of businesses that can pick and choose what books go out there, what books don't go out there, which will ultimately end up affecting the consumer in a negative way? Have you ever been stranded with a flat tire in the middle of nowhere? My first semester home from college, I was driving back to college, and that's what happened. I was halfway between two places, a couple miles from the exits, and I had to walk miles in the cold to get to a phone. That's why I would have loved at that point in time to have Air Moto, and that's why I bought it for my wife and kids, especially when they're traveling to remote places. With Air Moto, they don't have to depend on anyone else for help. They don't have to depend on walking or waiting in their car, hoping that nobody comes along while they're waiting for their friends or family to pick them up. This compact, high quality tool is always ready to go. You can put it right in the glove box, and it can actually inflate all four vehicle tires in a matter of minutes. It's powerful, it's reliable, and it gives my family peace of mind. Airmoto keeps us prepared for all the things that can happen to us with our tires while we're going. It's a great Christmas gift this year, and it'll just help you kind of just feel very comfortable for your wife and family as they travel. So, highly encourage you to get it. You can go to airmoto.com, or you can check out the link below in there and click through the link in order to order yours today.
Uh, well, there was a there was a case about that, and it was
Okay.
brought by authors against publishers, and the authors won. I'm not sure that they should have won, but look, publishing, it's an expensive thing, as I found out, to publish a book,
It
and
is.
it's even more expensive for companies that do this as a real business, because of all of the marketing and advertising costs, and they're printing many more copies of books than I am. Uh, so I understand their concern about wanting to find books that are going to sell in large numbers. And if you go to my wife's book club on once a month, you'll understand, uh, that most books are really kind of sensational, or they're written because they have marketing potential. They have, they're sex, violence, and rock and roll, or whatever.
Right.
Uh, Serious books are going to sell in smaller numbers. So, like this one. Uh, is it a monopoly? I don't know that it's a monopoly. It may just be the nature of the market, which I'm skipping way ahead here, but that's one of the things that the then um,
Can you give me an example? Can you give me an example of that? Because that sounds, I've never heard that used gerrymandering in the terms of economics before, only in the terms of political, mostly districting.
yeah. So one of my favorite examples is the case that the Biden administration brought against Apple recently, in the last couple of years, and which is still pending out there. There are a couple of different arguments that they've brought. Or allegations. One of them is about um, their managing of their store, their app store. Um, but the other, my favorite one, in terms of gerrymandering, is that they said that Apple has monopoly in what they called performance smartphones. That's the term that they used, and they identified performance smartphones as this one. The high end, fully loaded smartphone, lots of memory and stuff, and they said that in that space, that market, they were a monopoly. Well, if you think about it for a minute, you go to the Apple store to buy a phone. Uh, you don't have to buy a a performance, so-called performance smartphone. You can buy the previous edition. This is
Right.
a 15. There's a four. You can buy the 14. You can buy the 13. You can buy the 11. You can buy ones that don't have numbers at all. But you can buy refurbished ones. You can buy any number of smartphones. In other words, in terms of Apple's own offerings, they had to gerrymander a definition of performance smartphones to exclude all the other ones. And Apple is not even the largest manufacturer of smartphones. That's Samsung. So There you go.
So,
That,
so,
that's a gerrymandered market.
so, so, so it sounds like what they do is they just kind of redefine terms, which they're notorious for doing, in order to affect their political will. Because when I look at a small number of companies, it doesn't seem like the left cares that much whether they're big or not. It seems like they care more about whether it's a threat or not. And I say that because the media has shrunk tremendously in the last 30 years. And as far as who controls the major media, I'm not talking about like what we're doing here. I mean, that has changed the landscape, I think, of media as well. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but the media does the left doesn't seem to care about that. The left doesn't seem to care about the pharmaceutical industry, that can kind of control in those areas. But it seems like they target businesses that are a threat, not target businesses that are big. They're just trying to claim that's what they're doing. Would you agree with that statement, or do you think that it's
Yes, no, and
oversimplifying?
yes, I would, and I would expand on it. I believe that the government, this outgoing government, but even, and we can talk about this. I'm not sure about the incoming
I was going to
leadership.
ask you about that.
Yeah,
Keep going on this thought. We'll go there next.
okay. Um, the Biden administration, you know, put a woman by the name of Lena Khan in charge of the FTC, uh, who is, by all definitions and by the proclamation of her own former colleagues, a Marxist. Now people go, "Oh, what is that? It's just a word." No, I mean, she and Jonathan Cantor, who was the head of the Antitrust Division uh, in the last 4 years at the DOJ, really do not like big businesses. They do not like the big tech companies. They, uh, I think their argument is that big is simply bad. That bigness creates uh, allows these companies to be very powerful in the marketplace and to harm. They don't even want to talk about consumers anymore, but there's a litany of harms relating to everything from labor to equality or equity that they're concerned about. But basically, I think it's just bigness and it's power. I think the government generally, even if it's a Republican administration, doesn't like competitors to its power. Uh, you know, I think is why Elon Musk scares them. Uh, and maybe we should be scared about Elon Musk a little bit. I don't know, but not because he's big and powerful, because he has some really bad ideas. But the problem for the government is that there are these other centers now of power out there that they have to compete with, and they don't like that. So they want to regulate it. What was that old Ronald Reagan line? I can't remember, but if it moves, regulate it. If it stops moving, subsidize it. That sort of thing.
Something like that.
Yeah. So they don't like centers of power in this country and around the world. That Europe is after American big tech companies because they don't like them. Um, so it's really about power, I think.
Okay, so now we're now we change administrations, and who also is going to have to deal with threats to power. They're going to also have to deal with some of these issues. Where do you see this next administration going with in regards to competition?
Well, it's interesting. So the past administration was ideologically left, um, but one could argue, as I just was stating, that their real problem was with competing power centers. Um, the incoming administration, you have to remember, the Google antitrust case was brought by the last Trump administration. They filed the thing. It took it this long to get to court and for a judge to rule Google to be a monopoly. Um, but they brought that one. They tried to stop the AT&T Time Warner merger,
Right.
On the whim of Donald Trump, who didn't like CNN. So he went after, and then of course that whole thing. See, if they just let the market work, AT&T won the case. They got Time Warner, and then I think they realized we have no idea how to run a media company, you know, and so they sold it. Um, you know, better let the market work, I think. But so these guys are coming in. They have the Trump first administration has a history of, I think, uh, mild antipathy towards big business, which is funny considering Donald Trump and the fact that he's a billionaire and all that. But I think he's appointed a woman by the name of Gail Slater to be the head of the antitrust division. She came from the staff of J.D. Vance, who is a well-known sympathizer generally of Lena Khan, a so-called conservative Republican. But he is what has come to be known as a conservative. Um, they have a new Lena Khan's on the way out. I'm sure she'll get a nice job, being a dean of some law school someplace. And the fellow coming in is a Republican, Andrew Ferguson, former Solicitor General of Virginia, former, I think it was Scalia clerk, but maybe it was a Thomas clerk. I apologize. And another fellow, Mark Meader, who I know fairly well, was Mike Lee's antitrust staffer. Now he's going to be an FTC commissioner. When you look at this group of people, what you have is, not to be too harsh, I think at the Justice Department, someone who is likely to bring more cases, if that's what the administration wants to do. At the FTC, you have a new chair who believes that a revolution in antitrust is overdue, and I think will maybe more sympathetic to deals, but he's actually, the funny thing is I have right here, if I can pull it up somewhere, it was leaked out what he wrote to the president or to the transition people when he was applying to be the new chair. And he had an agenda, and his agenda was to reverse Lena Khan's anti-business agenda, but to hold big tech accountable and stop censorship. By the way, the stopping censorship part of this has nothing to do with antitrust, and therefore he has no business going into it. Yes, he clerked for Clarence Thomas, and he wants a full third of what he wrote here is about protecting freedom of speech and fighting wokeness. All laudable goals, but really something he has nothing to do with. It's not in his purview to do that. It needs to be done, I should emphasize, but it not by the FTC. So I think he's looking for a license to go hunt trophies in that area, which will harm business and competition. And the last guy is an out and out conservative, Mark Meader, and I think he's very dangerous, and he will look very much like the Democrats on the commission. So I'm not entirely sure where this is going to go. I think it could be better than the last management, but I think it also could be very similar. And I think it's a bad idea.
So the standard, the standard of the consumer welfare standard, and
Yeah.
although I agree completely 100% that that's the standard, I agree that that's the purpose of it. Where I struggle with it is who determines the welfare piece of it, and the reason why I say that is let's take the Facebook stuff. I mean, like a news came out literally. I just saw a news report this morning. I don't know if you've seen it yet. That Facebook is now going to move toward the X's version of instead of having the people regulating, the censorship, and Zuckerberg said, hey, it became too political leaning. It's amazing how we do that this year.
You're right.
And so I don't think that's a coincidence in the slightest, but at the same time, we recognize that, at least I would argue that in the 2020 election, with what we saw happening with the social media companies, and I don't think they were colluding with each other, colluding with the government, that was definitely not in the best interest of the consumer. That if we used a true consumer welfare standard, the government needed to get involved, and it wasn't a marketplace problem because the market didn't have time to react in the time that it needed to. So, so how do we determine that consumer welfare piece of it? Because they're not calling me asking me what I think is best. It's so how do we determine what exactly is there an objective standard, or is it just kind of who?
Well, are we mixing two things here? First of all,
Yeah.
the consumer welfare standard is let's define it. It's really a neutral principle. So
Okay.
if you
The Demas's family has been in the restaurant business for many generations. We have been serving people in the Middle Tennessee market for 34 years. Try our spaghetti kits, our pot roast, which we slow cook for 4 hours, or our world famous baked chicken and rice soup, which many locals have dubbed Greek penicillin for when you feel under the weather. We make our food fresh, and upon placing our order with us, we freeze the order and send it to your house. Demas's is more than a business. 5 generations of restaurant operators have taught us many things about food, but more importantly, we have recognized that we don't sell food. We sell the experience of bringing people and families together, which our country desperately needs. So go to demasfamilykitchen.com and share in this journey today. And for right now, use the code UNCOMMON to get 10% off of your order. That's demasfamilykitchen.com.
if you wander off from that neutral principle, I think you have a problem. Neutral
Okay.
meaning that it's not Republican, it's not Democrat, it's based on what consumers want. And if it's beneficial to consumers, not whether it's beneficial to labor or to particular, identity groups or to, um, it's really based on whether it's sound economics and facts about what's going on in a market. You have to define a market and say,
Okay.
okay, are consumers benefiting or being harmed? And then if they are being harmed, you intervene. Um, but I think you just started talking again about um, Mark Zuckerberg and what he's doing to, I think, try to uh, lighten up on the censorship that his uh, operation does, Facebook does, I assume Instagram as well. Um, but that's not antitrust. I mean, that's speech, and I don't think speech is regulated by the antitrust. Tell me why that's an antitrust issue.
Well, I guess when you have companies that control, in this particular situation, you have a small number of companies, and we'll go off of, I'm gonna divert a little bit off the social media to go more of to the mainstream media. When I look at the number of companies that actually are represented in the White House press briefing room, for example, it's an extremely small number. The lack of competition in there, I think, creates an intellectual dishonesty among the reporters because they don't have to be held to it,
Right.
to a
I
standard.
agree entirely. And I've been in that press room when I was a reporter and subsequently. And it's a small, it's tiny. And
Right.
and frankly, the physical nature of it, the smallness of it, contributes to this problem of definition of what is media. Uh,
But
and, and I remember during the first Trump administration, I think it was, maybe it was, I don't think it was Bush administration or the Obama administration. They started allowing reporters from around the country to call in, you know, and I thought that was a good thing. Um, but uh, but again, I don't think the issue of access of the media, of whatever you define the media to be, is an antitrust issue. It's a maybe in some cases it's an FCC issue because it involves broadcast media. Um, I think there's a lot of work to be done on what they call Section 230, which is the law giving protections to these platforms so that so they can't be sued for whatever gets published on their platform. Um, but I just think it's another problem altogether. And I would be very happy to support personally, not as an antitrust expert, an alternative to the current system. And it sounds to me, in some ways, like the market is working. X changed because it came under new ownership, and these other companies are changing because the United States just came under new ownership, so to speak, or new leadership anyway. They're all terrified, and maybe that's a good thing. But I do think that finding a system that we can turn into law would be a better way to go than just having to frighten billionaire executives into doing the right thing. And who knows whether they're really doing the right thing. I haven't seen what you're talking about yet.
so when you're looking at antitrust, you're strictly defining it as only from an economic perspective. Do you not see any dangers of monopolies of businesses that could impact other areas of our country, like speech, for example?
Well, I do, but I don't think that our antitrust regime is set up to do that, to deal with that, and I don't think it's supposed to. Again, I should point out that the antitrust enforcement regime that we operate under now, um, is 45 years old, roughly 1979, and it doesn't it wasn't because of a law didn't come into place because of a law passed by Congress and signed by the President of the United States. It's judge-made law. It's
Right.
9-0, but it's judge-made law. And so, there's some who think we should write a law to deal with competition, a new law that takes into account the sort of current modern interpretations of antitrust, even post the consumer welfare standard. And I go back and forth on whether or not I think that's a good idea, because the idea of some of these people I know up on the Hill sitting around arguing over definitions and then having them decide what the definitions are, seems to me a prescription for disaster. Um, but I do think that the current system, or the last 45 years, has worked very well. It has, one of the things that got me really, really steamed about when I started doing this was that Joe Biden decided to hold a press conference where he talked about the failed experiment of the last 40 years, 45 years, by which he was referring to my father and the consumer welfare standard, and called it a failed experiment, and basically said that the number of small businesses that were formed during this time was down, and it was not sufficient, that the economy had not done well, that talk about the stock market. All of these indicators he gave were absolute lies. The the stock market had gone up 10% consistently year over year on average. The number of new businesses formed was, basically well, from your perspective that way, uh, it had gone up substantially. I don't remember the numbers exactly, but basically under the consumer welfare standard and other deregulatory actions by the Reagan administration and the Trump administration, even under some cases under the Bush administration, we were all better off economically. So I'm not sure I really want a reevaluation by a bunch of Congress people who all have different axes to grind than basically what is a neutral principle that's not Republican or Democrat. It's designed to benefit the consumer. That was a long way around, but I'm very nervous about that. But again, I don't think that allowing the for Congress or for the FTC or the DOJ antitrust divisions to grab hold of antitrust and turn it into a cudgel uh, uh, for free speech. I mean, first of all, do I really want the government to decide what is free speech?
Right.
You know, what is appropriate speech by, and that's why I think all the people like Mark Zuckerberg are issuing, new plans and edicts and making statements now because they don't want the government to decide either.
Do you think there ought to be some other form of protection for the consumer in these situations? So, for example, when they allow, I mean, they have a protection from lawsuits, for example. USA Today reran an article from a little local magazine here that ultimately BBC picked it up, and it made me a little small-time restaurant operator. I was looked like a homophobic, and it was funny because even BBC retracted the story when I gave them the facts, but by then it's too late on the internet. And when I talked to a lawyer about it, I'm like, what can we do about this? And he's like, well, you're considered a public official or a public, yeah. And I'm like, how? And he's like, well, locally, you're well known locally. And so as a result of that, there was really little we could do that wouldn't have created it. Should there be other protections that's outside of the scope of antitrust in these situations that you would feel
Yes, I think there should be. I think there should be, and I think they are very, very difficult to engineer. And good luck to the people who know how to do that. But there was something floating around which never went anywhere called the PACE Act or something like that that gave. I think the basic details, it never passed, but it gave users, opportunities to demand corrections on a faster correction, or faster appeals to the platforms, and then have recourse if they didn't do it. It seemed like a move in the right direction, but I hadn't given it a lot of thought because, frankly, I mean, I spent most of my time just pushing back on the notion that this is something the antitrust law should be allowed to do. Because if you let it do this, and you let it decide, what is unfair competition in a non-economic sense, and what the harm to the consumer is, that isn't based on economics or uh, facts, then, and it all becomes very subjective, then basically it has no value at all. Uh, you know, I believe this should be antitrust should be compartmentalized within this law, and speech, which is a very difficult issue, should be find its own place, in the law. Um, and I think it's going to be ugly, and there'll be a lot of fighting about it, but ultimately that's what has to be done. In the meantime, let Donald Trump scare the pants off these people, and we'll get some results that way.
Now, where you would be in favor of an antitrust action, I would imagine, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's an example back. He's a friend of mine, Mark Whitaker, who was they made a movie, The Informant, where it was he was an ADM executive, and there was like a multinational lysine price fixing scheme that actually impacted these large companies like Coca-Cola, Tyson, et cetera. He ended up wearing a wire, and a lot of people busted. It was during the same times of Enron,
I
WorldCom.
remember the book, and well,
Yeah.
actually, I remember the 60 Minutes pieces, and I remember the movie. Yes, and just without speaking directly to that case, I think price fixing is a horrible thing, and it ought to be prosecuted, and it can be prosecuted. Um, Not just by the federal government, but by state governments. We have a whole army of state attorneys general who can bring price fixing cases. That they don't, because it typically means that they have to pick on some company that is probably a contributor. Um, but they could, and that would be a natural place for them to go. And that is a obvious place for antitrust to go. So I'm all in favor of that.
In Acts 5, we see that when Peter and the other disciples were ordered to stop talking about Jesus, they responded, "We obey God and not man." In 2020, we saw something we never thought we could see in this country. They shut down our churches. After decades of removing God from schools and public institutions, they went straight at our community. Unfortunately, we as Christians did not know what to do, and even worse, we chose to listen to false prophets masquerading as Christians on how to respond. I recognize this is the only beginning, and we need to know how to respond. We have a duty to say no to unjust laws, but as Christians, we have a greater duty to God. In my book, On the Duty of Christian Civil Disobedience, I use biblical teachings to help believers know when and how to stand up to those in charge when they ask us to commit evil. You can go to peterdemas.org to find out about our duty to say no. And when you type in the code UNCOMMON, you can get 10% off your order. That's uncommon at peterdemas.org. Remember, we are to obey God and not man. Well, I appreciate this conversation. Like I said, to me, this is it's fascinating because being in law, being in business, seeing the impacts that sometimes when I have to negotiate with a large business versus small ones, it really fascinates me when I read about it in some of these cases. If people want to know more about it, how do they find out? Well, first of all, you said you can get the book, your father's book that you reissued on Amazon and Barnes and Noble, uh,
Yep.
the Antitrust Paradox. Where else can they get more information on what you're doing, your organization, and if they want to learn more about how this impacts them?
Well, first of all, we have a website, antitrusteducationproject.org, and everything that we write, whether it's a blog post or an op-ed, or ends up there. We also have a Twitter or X account at Antitrust EDU. And if you go to YouTube, you'll find videos of interviews that I've given or webinars. There's actually a pretty, the Federal Society did a day-long program when we issued the book about about my father and his views of antitrust, and that's available on YouTube. So there's lots of good places to learn about it, but there are many other good sources of information. There's a blog or a website called Truth on the Market, which features a number of my friends who are on my advisory board. There's also the International Center for Law and Economics. there's lots of good thinking out there about this, and hopefully, if I can misuse the word, um, this next administration will be a largely a break on some of the bad things that have been going on over the last 4 years. And hopefully, this new Senate and House, led by the Antitrust uh, uh, subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee, led by Senator Mike Lee, who actually wrote the introduction to the new edition, um, will do good things. I know that the head of the chair of the House Judiciary Committee is very much aligned with our thinking, but there's always the temptation to beat up on another power center, whether it's big tech or big potato or big restaurant, big
Right.
retail. There was just a decision in a case about price fixing in the French fry and French fry market. Uh, so there's lots of information out there, and I think ours is probably the best written for the non-lawyer. So I would urge people to go there.
All right. Well, I greatly appreciate you and the work you're doing and helping educate people as well as just kind of being a watchdog in a lot of these situations because you're right, it can both sides can take advantage of this, and so I appreciate all that you're doing. And I let me know anything that we can do to further help you, or you see anything that you want to get out, feel free to reach out.
We're working on a second book uh, published by Bork Publishing that is not my father's book, but it's by me. And uh, I'll let you know. We can come back and talk about that.
That sounds good. Well, again, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And you have a good rest of the day.